November 19th, 1942. In a small wood-paneled room in the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin held a telephone receiver against his ear, his other hand gripping the edge of his desk. The voice on the other end belonged to General Alexander Vasilevsky, calling from a command post hundreds of miles to the south. Stalin's face, normally a mask of controlled authority, showed something his inner circle rarely witnessed. His eyes were fixed on the wall map across from him, where red pins marked Soviet positions forming a closing vise around Stalingrad. When Vasilevsky finished his report, Stalin set down the receiver with unusual care. He stood, walked to the map, and for nearly a minute said nothing. Then, almost to himself, he spoke words that would never appear in any official record but would be remembered by the three generals present in the room. They cannot escape now. The Germans cannot escape. This moment, this quiet realization in a room far from the front, marked the beginning of Stalin's understanding that the seemingly invincible Wehrmacht was finally, irreversibly breaking. But to understand what those words meant, to grasp the weight they carried, you have to know what Stalin had endured to reach this point. You have to understand the depth of his earlier terror, the scale of his miscalculations, and the immensity of what he was now witnessing. June 22nd, 1941. Stalin had refused to believe it was happening even as the reports flooded in. German forces had crossed the Soviet border at multiple points, launching the largest invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, 750,000 horses, and thousands of aircraft were pouring into Soviet territory. Stalin's response to the initial reports was denial so profound that his subordinates feared for their lives when delivering updates. "This cannot be," he reportedly said. "Hitler would not dare." But Hitler had dared, and within days, the scale of the catastrophe became undeniable. Soviet forces were being encircled and destroyed in massive pockets. Entire armies were ceasing to exist. The city of Minsk fell within a week. By the end of June, the Germans had advanced over 250 miles into Soviet territory. Stalin, according to those who saw him during these first weeks, appeared to age years in days. His confidence, built on his absolute control over the Soviet state, shattered against the reality of German military superiority. Nikita Khrushchev, then a political commissar with Soviet forces, would later write about visiting Moscow during this period. Stalin, he said, looked like a man who had been physically struck. The dictator who had purged millions, who had shown no mercy to perceived enemies, who had never publicly displayed weakness, was visibly shaken. He retreated to his dacha outside Moscow and for several days refused to take calls or issue orders. The Soviet government effectively had no leader during some of the most critical days of the invasion. When Stalin finally returned to active command, he did so with a desperation that permeated every order, every decision. His infamous Order Number 227, issued on July 28, 1942, revealed the depth of his fear. "Not one step back," it declared. Retreat without orders meant execution. Soldiers who surrendered were traitors to the motherland. Blocking detachments were positioned behind Soviet lines with orders to shoot any soldier who fled. Stalin was fighting the Germans with terror as much as with tactics, trying to hold together an army that had been shattered repeatedly. The winter of 1941 to 1942 brought the first check to German advances. Soviet forces counterattacked outside Moscow, driving the Wehrmacht back for the first time. Stalin's confidence began to recover, but this proved premature. When the Germans launched their summer offensive in 1942, aimed at the Caucasus oil fields and the city of Stalingrad, Soviet forces again retreated in disorder. By August, German forces were fighting in the streets of Stalingrad itself. General Vasily Chuikov, given command of the 62nd Army defending Stalingrad, received his orders directly from Stalin. The conversation was brief and brutal in its clarity. "Hold the city," Stalin told him. "If you lose Stalingrad, you will not leave it alive." Chuikov understood perfectly. This was not metaphor. This was Stalin's method. Victory or death, with no middle ground. Through September and October of 1942, Stalingrad became a nightmare of urban combat. German forces controlled most of the city. Soviet defenders clung to narrow strips along the Volga River, sometimes holding positions measured in dozens of yards. The fighting was house to house, room to room, sometimes hand to hand. German commanders reported to Hitler that they were making progress, but the progress was measured in blood and time. Every factory, every apartment block, every pile of rubble became a fortress. Stalin monitored the battle obsessively. He called commanders multiple times daily, demanding updates, issuing orders, threatening consequences for failure. But something was different now. While German forces ground forward in Stalingrad, Stalin and his senior commanders were planning something the Germans did not anticipate. The Soviets were learning. General Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's most trusted military mind, had been studying the German positions around Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, had pushed deep into the city, but in doing so, it had created a salient, a bulge in the front lines. The flanks of this salient were held not by German forces, but by Romanian and Italian armies, less well-equipped and less experienced. Zhukov saw the vulnerability. He brought his analysis to Stalin in September. The meeting was tense. Stalin, burned by so many failures, was skeptical of ambitious plans. But Zhukov was persistent. A massive counter-offensive, he proposed, striking at the weak points on the flanks, could encircle the entire German Sixth Army. It would require enormous resources, complete secrecy, and perfect timing. Stalin listened. For the first time in the war, he was hearing a plan that did not involve desperate defense or limited counterattacks. This was something different. This was thinking on the German scale. Stalin approved the plan, but with characteristic caution. The operation, codenamed Uranus, would require months of preparation. Troops had to be assembled without the Germans noticing. Supplies had to be stockpiled. The timing had to be perfect. And through it all, the defenders in Stalingrad had to keep the Germans focused on the city itself, had to prevent them from noticing what was building on their flanks. Chuikov's men held. Through October and into November, they held. The German advance slowed, then stopped, then became a grinding stalemate in the ruins. German soldiers, who had conquered most of Europe, found themselves fighting for individual buildings, exhausting themselves in a meat grinder that consumed divisions. November 19th arrived with snow and fog. Soviet artillery opened fire at 7:30 in the morning, a barrage so intense it could be heard over 100 miles away. Thousands of guns fired simultaneously along a front north of Stalingrad. The Romanian Third Army, holding the northern flank of the German salient, disintegrated under the assault. Soviet tanks poured through the gaps. The next day, a second Soviet offensive struck the southern flank, smashing through the Romanian Fourth Army. The two Soviet pincers began racing toward each other. Stalin received reports throughout the day. Each update confirmed what the plan had promised. The encirclement was working. German forces were being trapped. On November 23rd, Soviet forces from the northern and southern offensives met at the town of Kalach, west of Stalingrad. The trap closed. The German Sixth Army, over 290,000 men, was surrounded. This was when Stalin made the phone call to Vasilevsky. This was when he spoke those words about the Germans being unable to escape. Because Stalin understood what this meant. For the first time since the war began, a major German army was at the mercy of Soviet forces. Not retreating in good order, not withdrawing to prepared positions, but trapped, surrounded, and running out of supplies. The Germans understood it too. General Paulus immediately requested permission to break out of the encirclement. Hitler refused. The Sixth Army would hold Stalingrad, Hitler ordered. The Luftwaffe would supply them by air. A relief force would break through to them. Paulus was to stand firm. Stalin, reading intercepted German communications, watched this decision with something approaching satisfaction. Hitler's refusal to allow retreat meant the Sixth Army would remain in place, would consume its supplies, would weaken day by day. The Luftwaffe's promise to supply an entire army by air was, Stalin's commanders assured him, impossible. The relief force attempting to break through could be stopped. Every day the Germans remained trapped was a day they grew weaker. Through December, German forces attempted to break the encirclement. General Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable commanders, led a relief effort that came within 30 miles of the trapped army. Soviet forces, reinforced and fighting with new confidence, stopped the advance. By late December, Manstein's relief force was itself in danger of encirclement and had to withdraw. The Sixth Army was alone. Stalin's mood during these weeks was described by those around him as transformed. The haunted, desperate leader of 1941 was gone. In his place was a commander who sensed victory. He still issued threats, still demanded absolute obedience, still showed no mercy for failure. But there was a confidence now that had been absent before. When he spoke with commanders, his questions were different. Not, "Can you hold?" but, "When will they surrender?" The German Sixth Army began to starve. Luftwaffe transport planes attempted to deliver supplies, but Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns destroyed them in increasing numbers. The planes that did land brought nowhere near enough food, ammunition, or medicine. German soldiers were reduced to eating horses, then to eating anything they could find. The wounded died from lack of medical supplies. The cold, dropping to 30 below zero, killed men who lacked the calories to maintain body heat. On January 8, 1943, Soviet forces offered surrender terms to Paulus. The offer was generous by Stalin's standards, guaranteed safety for all who surrendered, retention of personal belongings, normal rations, and repatriation after the war. Paulus, still following Hitler's orders, refused. The assault on the pocket resumed. Soviet forces split the pocket in two, then began crushing each half separately. German resistance, fierce at first, crumbled as units ran out of ammunition and strength. On January 31st, Paulus, newly promoted to field marshal by Hitler in a gesture meant to stiffen his resolve, surrendered the southern pocket. 2 days later, the northern pocket surrendered. Over 90,000 German soldiers went into Soviet captivity. More than 200,000 had died in the pocket. Stalin's public statement on the victory was triumphant but measured. "The Red Army has won a great victory," he declared. But his private comments, recorded in memoirs and reports, revealed something deeper. "The myth of the invincible German army is destroyed," he told a gathering of commanders. "The Germans can be beaten. The Germans will be beaten." But Stalin's full realization that Germany's army was breaking came not at Stalingrad, but in the month that followed. Because Stalingrad, as massive as it was, could have been an aberration, a single disaster for Germany in a war that was far from over. What convinced Stalin that the Wehrmacht was truly finished was what happened next. Spring of 1943 brought a lull in major operations as both sides rebuilt their forces. German commanders planned a massive offensive at the Kursk salient, a bulge in the Soviet lines south of Moscow. Code-named Operation Citadel, it would involve nearly 1 million German troops, 2,700 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft. It would be Germany's attempt to regain the initiative, to prove that the Wehrmacht could still launch successful offensive operations. Stalin knew the attack was coming. Soviet intelligence, including information from the Lucy spy ring in Switzerland, provided detailed information about German plans. More importantly, the Kursk salient was an obvious target. Soviet forces had months to prepare. They constructed defensive lines with a depth unprecedented in military history. 8 separate defensive belts, extending over 120 miles deep. Millions of mines, thousands of anti-tank guns, prepared positions for every eventuality. The German attack began on July 5, 1943. It immediately ran into the prepared defenses. German tanks, including the new Panthers and Tigers that were supposed to give them decisive advantage, became bogged down in minefields and engaged by dug-in Soviet anti-tank guns. The advance, planned to move dozens of miles per day, measured progress in hundreds of yards. Stalin monitored the battle from Moscow, receiving updates every few hours. Unlike in earlier battles, he did not panic as German forces pushed forward. He understood now what his commanders had prepared. The Germans were being bled. Every mile they advanced cost them tanks and men they could not replace. The Soviet defenses were absorbing the attack, channeling German forces into killing zones, destroying the Wehrmacht's offensive power. The Battle of Prokhorovka on July 12th became the largest tank battle in history. Over 1,500 tanks engaged in a single day. The fighting was chaotic and brutal, with Soviet and German tanks firing at point-blank range. The battle ended without a clear victor, but that was the point. The Germans needed decisive victory. A draw meant failure. By July 13th, the German offensive had stalled. Hitler, facing Allied landings in Sicily and needing forces elsewhere, ordered the operation cancelled. German forces began withdrawing. Soviet forces immediately counterattacked. The Kursk battle, which Germany had intended as a decisive offensive, had become a decisive defensive victory for the Soviets. Stalin's reaction to Kursk was different from his reaction to Stalingrad. After Stalingrad, he had been triumphant but cautious, uncertain if the victory was the beginning of a trend or a fortunate exception. After Kursk, according to multiple sources, his certainty was absolute. Marshal Zhukov, in his memoirs, described a meeting with Stalin in mid-July. "The Germans have lost their last chance," Stalin told him. "From now on, we advance. They retreat. This is how the war ends." The statement proved prophetic. From July 1943 onward, Soviet forces were almost continuously on the offensive. German forces fought skillfully, conducting fighting retreats, inflicting heavy casualties, but they were always retreating. The Wehrmacht never again launched a major offensive operation on the Eastern Front. Stalin's public speeches during the latter half of 1943 reflected his growing confidence. On November 6, 1943, the anniversary of the revolution, he declared that the Red Army has seized the initiative and will not surrender it. The statement was not bombast. It was recognition of a military reality that Stalin now fully understood. But what exactly did Stalin understand? What did he see that convinced him Germany's army was breaking? First, he understood that Germany had reached the limits of its manpower. The losses at Stalingrad and Kursk, combined with continuous attrition along the entire Eastern Front, meant Germany was running out of trained soldiers. Soviet intelligence reported that German divisions were being rebuilt with younger and older men, with troops from occupied territories, with anyone who could hold a rifle. The quality of German infantry was declining. Second, Stalin saw that Germany's material advantages were disappearing. Soviet factories, relocated beyond the Urals and running at full capacity, were producing more tanks, more aircraft, more artillery than German industry. The T-34 tank, once outmatched by German armor, was being produced in numbers that overwhelmed German defenses. Soviet artillery, organized in massive concentrations, could deliver firepower that German forces could not match. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Stalin recognized that Soviet commanders had learned how to fight. The Red Army of 1941 had been led by officers who survived Stalin's purges by being politically reliable rather than militarily competent. Many of the best Soviet commanders had been executed in the late 1930s. But war is a brutal teacher. The officers who survived the disasters of 1941 and 1942 were survivors because they could adapt, could learn, could fight effectively. Zhukov, Konstantin Rokossovsky, Ivan Konev, and others had studied German tactics and developed counters. They understood combined arms warfare. They could plan and execute operations on the German scale. Stalin's conversations with these commanders changed. In 1941, he had issued orders and demanded obedience. By late 1943, he was having discussions, asking questions, accepting advice. This shift, subtle but significant, indicated his growing confidence in both his commanders and his army. There was another factor in Stalin's realization, one that was psychological rather than military. Stalin understood that the German army's greatest weapon had been its reputation for invincibility. German soldiers had fought with the confidence that they could not be beaten. Soviet soldiers in the early war had often broken and run when facing German attacks because they believed resistance was futile. Stalingrad and Kursk shattered this psychological dynamic. German soldiers now knew they could be surrounded, could be defeated, could be destroyed. Soviet soldiers knew they could win. Stalin's statements in private meetings during late 1943 and early 1944 revealed a leader who was now planning for victory rather than survival. He discussed post-war borders with Allied leaders. He planned the occupation of Eastern Europe. He thought about the shape of the peace, not just the conduct of the war. This was not the Stalin of June 1941, who had nearly collapsed under the shock of invasion. This was a leader who had endured, adapted, and now anticipated triumph. But Stalin being Stalin, his confidence came with characteristic brutality. As Soviet forces advanced westward, they entered territories that had been under German occupation. Stalin's orders regarding these territories were harsh. Populations that had collaborated with Germans faced deportation or execution. Ethnic groups suspected of disloyalty were relocated en masse. The NKVD followed the advancing Red Army, establishing Soviet control with methods as ruthless as any employed by the Germans. Soviet soldiers advancing into Eastern Europe also brought with them a desire for revenge. German forces had devastated Soviet territory, had killed millions of civilians, had implemented policies of deliberate starvation and extermination. Soviet soldiers, seeing the ruins of their homeland, entered German territory with rage. The atrocities committed by Soviet forces during the advance into Germany were extensive and brutal. Stalin, when reports of mass rapes and civilian killings reached him, reportedly said, "Can't you understand it if a soldier who has crossed thousands of kilometers through blood and fire has fun with a woman or takes a trifle?" This was Stalin's victory. Not clean, not noble, but absolute. The Soviet system, for all its brutality and inefficiency, had survived the greatest military onslaught in history and was now destroying the army that had launched it. The final confirmation of Stalin's realization came in the winter and spring of 1945. Soviet forces launched massive offensives that shattered German defenses. The Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945 advanced over 300 miles in 3 weeks, reaching within 40 miles of Berlin. German forces, defending their homeland, fought with desperate courage but could not stop the advance. Stalin's planning for the assault on Berlin revealed a leader who was thinking beyond military victory to political positioning. He insisted that Soviet forces take Berlin before the Western Allies, even though this meant launching the assault before all preparations were complete. The Battle of Berlin, beginning in April 1945, cost Soviet forces over 80,000 dead and nearly 300,000 wounded. But Berlin fell to Soviet forces. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. Germany surrendered unconditionally. On May 9, 1945, Stalin addressed the Soviet people. His speech was triumphant, declaring total victory over fascism. But those who had been with him since June 1941 noted something in his demeanor. The tension that had defined him through the war years was gone. He had led the Soviet Union through its greatest crisis and emerged victorious. The cost had been staggering. Over 27 million Soviet citizens dead. Entire cities destroyed. Populations displaced, but Stalin had survived, and the Soviet Union had survived, and the German army that had seemed invincible was destroyed. What Stalin said when he realized Germany's army was finally breaking was not a single dramatic statement. It was a progression of realizations, beginning with that quiet moment in November 1942, when he understood the Germans could not escape Stalingrad, continuing through the certainty, after Kursk, that the Wehrmacht had lost its offensive power, and culminating in the confident planning for post-war Europe that characterized his final war years. Stalin's words to his commanders in those years revealed a man who had passed through terror and emerged with brutal confidence. "The Germans are finished," he told a gathering of officers in early 1944. "They fight well still, but they cannot win. Every day they are weaker. Every day we are stronger. This is mathematics, not hope." And it was mathematics. The Soviet Union, with its vast population and resources, its relocated industries producing weapons in quantities Germany could not match, its growing military competence and its absolute willingness to accept casualties that would have broken other nations, had become a military machine that the Wehrmacht could not stop. Stalin's realization that Germany's army was breaking was the realization that his gamble had paid off. His purges of the officer corps had nearly cost him everything in 1941. His insistence on standing firm rather than conducting strategic retreats had led to massive encirclements and losses. His brutal methods of maintaining discipline had killed thousands of his own soldiers, but in the end, the Soviet system had proven capable of absorbing punishment that would have destroyed other nations and emerging stronger. The final words on this subject perhaps belong to Zhukov, who knew Stalin as well as any military commander. In his memoirs, he described Stalin in the war's final months as a man who had achieved what he had spent his entire political life pursuing, absolute proof of his correctness. Stalin had been right to industrialize the Soviet Union at breakneck speed, right to relocate factories beyond the Urals, right to demand total obedience and total sacrifice. The victory over Germany was, in Stalin's mind, vindication of everything he had done, justification for every purge, every deportation, every execution. When Stalin realized Germany's army was finally breaking, what he said was less important than what he understood. He understood that he had survived, that the Soviet Union had survived, that the system he had built, for all its cruelty and inefficiency, had proven capable of defeating the most powerful military machine in history. And that understanding, that realization, shaped the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe for the next 46 years, until the system Stalin built finally collapsed under its own contradictions. But in May 1945, standing in the Kremlin as Berlin burned and German forces surrendered across Europe, Stalin knew only that he had won. The Germans who had seemed invincible in June 1941 were broken. And Stalin, who had nearly broken himself in those first terrible weeks, had endured to see their destruction.